If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep to the slaughter. Dear listener, you're the sheep today. That quote is from listener of the show, George Washington, and we'll get back to his ass here in a moment. First, let me tell you what the hell you're listening to. This is episode number 239 of 10ish Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Emel. Every episode, we cover a new top 10ish list along with fun facts, trivia, and hot takes. My Sidekick Host rotates every week, and this week's Sidekick Host is Jerry Landry. Jerry?
Nick, it's been a bit. How the hell are you?
It's been a bit. It's been I was looking back today. It's been a year, pretty much, since you were on, which is hard to believe, but here you are.
And there has been a lot that's happened in that year. Case in point, we are recording today, and we had a historic event happen. We've had a speaker ousted by his own party.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah. So we're recording on the day that Kevin McCarthy was removed as Speaker of the House unanimously by both sides, I think.
History happening in the process.
And we're going to talk all kinds of history, more history than anybody wants. So much history, we're going to make you throw up today. And that's because I knew when I wanted to do this topic, there was only one man to call, and that was Jerry, because he is the host of the amazingly well-done history podcast called Presidencies of the United States. Jerry is my presidential history expert, and he's been on the show in the past. He was on episode 193, where I had him guess the top 10 biggest presidential scandals, and he brought me a list back on 169, the wealthiest presidents. So, Jerry, you think you're smarter than the rest of us, don't you? Just go on and admit it.
I will not admit that. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. I will not admit anything. I am not a crook.
Well, okay, let's not lose all credibility so early on in the show, Jerry. We want people to stick with us. Jerry, what got you interested in American history in the first place?
I've always been fascinated by U.S. presidential history. It's just there are so many fascinating figures, so many fascinating characters involved in that. But one of the things that I was always interested in is not just the individuals who have served as president, but also we realized that their presidencies couldn't function without all the other folks.
For sure.
There have been so many stories, so many lives that have been lost in the annals of history. And so when I started presidencies, it was really trying to get the whole picture, trying to make this get away from this idea of these monumental figures, these marble statue figures that are completely unvarnished. They're people just like us. Mm-hmm. And so in presidencies, that's what I try to do is bring back that human element and try and talk about these amazing, complex, and sometimes reprehensible individuals.
Oh, yeah.
And just really get into what a complicated legacy we have as American citizens in our nation's history, and hopefully learning from the history and being able to move forward to something better.
Complicated history, to say the least, my God. And doing the research for today's topic, which if you're new to the show, Jerry, as the Sidekick Host, he does not know today's topic yet until I tell him here in a minute. But while I was doing research, I kept coming back to that time and time again. The colored, checkered past of American history. We're going to get all into it. Jerry, I'm going to introduce today's topic by telling you about a recent trip I took to Boston, Massachusetts. Have you been to Boston?
Oh, yes.
Yep.
Quite a few times.
Well, I took the time to see some historic sites there. I'm sure you've done the same. I saw Paul Revere's house. I saw Ben Franklin's childhood home. And this led me down a rabbit hole of researching early American history, kind of colonial times. And I'm taking the rest of you down this rabbit hole with me. We're going to talk about the very earliest days of America. We're talking about the founding fathers of America specifically. First, I'm going to read this little intro that I pulled from history.com. Without them, there would be no United States of America. The founding fathers, a group of predominantly wealthy plantation owners and businessmen, united 13 desperate colonies, fought for independence from Britain, and penned a series of influential governing documents that steered the country to this day. All the founding fathers, including the first 4 U.S. presidents, at one point considered themselves British subjects, but they revolted against the restrictive rule of King George III. outlining their grievances in the Declaration of Independence, a powerful call for freedom and equality, and won a stunning military victory over what was then the world's preeminent superpower. When the federal government tottered under the Articles of Confederation, prominent citizens met again to hammer out the U.S. Constitution. Showing foresight, they included the Bill of Rights, which enshrined many civil liberties into law and provided a blueprint for other emerging democracies. Almost done. America's founders are defined as those who signed the United States Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, and the United States Constitution, among others. Historian Richard B. Morris said in 1973, he identified 7 figures as the key founders based on what he called the triple tests of leadership, longevity, and statesmanship. So, Jerry, of all the founding fathers, you're going to be guessing the 7 key founders today. So you could think of those as the most well-known, the most prominent, the most important of the founding fathers. There's 7 of those, and I'm adding an 8th because I saw this 8th father mentioned on a lot of other lists. So again, put simply, these are the 8 most important founding fathers of America.
Interesting.
Let me acknowledge my sources real quick. History.com, constitutionfacts.com, battlefields.org, and study.com, along with some trivia from Wikipedia. So you might be wondering, founding fathers of America, how are those ranked? Because there is no ranking, right? They're all just equally founding fathers. Well, of these 8 that you're going to guess, I, Nick Emel, took it upon myself to rank them based on what I think are the most well-known. So number 8 is the least well-known, least talked about founding father. Number 1 is the most famous, most well-known, most talked about founding father, in my opinion. And you can tell me if you agree or disagree with those as we go. Whew. Jerry, what do you think? Are you excited?
I'm very excited. And that was a mouthful.
Yes, thank you for indulging me. And I knew you'd like this because on your show, you've been deep in the guts of early America from the first presidency and onward. I think you're in James Madison now, right?
Yes.
The James Madison series. So, yeah, so all of this probably very familiar to you. But I'm going to ask you now, do you think the average American could name these 8 founding fathers off the top of their head?
I think there are some that are obvious choices, but there's so many other figures that could potentially be on this list. And I'm imagining that there are probably 1 or 2 that folks wouldn't be as well aware of. And even with the ones that they know, there's so many stories that they probably don't know, or misconceptions. You know, that's one thing that I found. Yeah. And especially, I'm not going to name him yet, but there's a guy with a cherry tree that is infamous for the myths.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
It's just amazing to be able to really get into these figures, because once you get through the mythos and get to the real people underneath, I think it's even more powerful of a story.
And more interesting.
Yeah.
More interesting once you dive in and see these people that, like you said, they're kind of held up on these pedestals, at least in American culture, as these legends. Like you almost you could look at George Washington the same way you look at like a Greek god, right? Yeah. He's just this like otherworldly, like but he was just a man, and a flawed man, very flawed man. So obviously we only have, an hour-ish to get through all 8 of these guys. For each of them, we'll look at their accomplishments, but also their everyday person, like you said. So Jerry, in like 90 seconds or less, tell us about the history that brought America to be founded.
90 seconds or less. Okay. So basically, Britain decided, let's found some colonies in North America. They were founded on the Eastern Seaboard, but it ultimately came to a point where relationship with Britain isn't working anymore. We want something else. We're not aligning with the British government anymore. So let's go ahead and declare independence. And we fought a war. Ultimately, we were able to achieve independence. We struggled a bit in terms of the first iteration of government. Finally decided, let's go back to the drawing board. Let's do a constitution and form this new federal government, which is what we have to the present day.
I didn't time it, but I would bet that was less than 90 seconds. So kudos to you. Congratulations. What Jerry said. And when these British colonies were formed in America, no man, woman, or child had ever been in the Americas before. They were the very first ones here. They didn't slaughter and kill the millions of people that were here before them.
No, not at all.
No, of course. It was a whole new world, whole new frontier. Anyway, Jerry, without further ado, I've delayed it long enough. Tell me who you think, well, I'm sure you know them, but name off some of the founding fathers of America who most people would consider the primary founding fathers of America.
So I'll go ahead and eliminate a few folks, and especially the fact that you said founding fathers. There's so many other folks, so many stories out there. I highly encourage folks to learn about the other people besides the founding fathers. But within the founding fathers, there are also some really interesting characters. So I'm going to start my guess with John Hancock.
John Hancock. John Hancock was not listed in these. Are you surprised by that? Because I was.
I'm a little surprised by that. He did kind of fade after making that famous signature, but he was still a prominent figure. But that is interesting that he wasn't included in this.
Yeah, John Hancock, despite, the famous saying about your John Hancock and all that, he was not one of them.
So let's go with another guy that I'm pretty sure will be on this list, and not just because of his beer, Samuel Adams.
Samuel Adams, my God, or by God, he is definitely on this list. I put him as number 4. I put him as so again, just to remind the listeners, number 1 is who I consider the most well-known. Number 8 is who I consider the least well-known among these, and Samuel Adams is right in the middle at number 4. And at the end, I want your take, Jerry, on if you agree with my ranking. But Samuel Adams, he's got the beer, but he was a very important figure in American history as well. He was a political firebrand who drummed up immense opposition to British policies in Boston, a hotbed of the resistance, believing that the colonists were subject to taxation without representation. He joined the Sons of Liberty, an underground dissident group that at times resorted to tarring and feathering British loyalists. Jerry, have you ever come across maybe a bad podcast review? Someone gave you 1 star on Apple Podcasts and you located them and tarred and feathered them? Because I have.
To date, I have not, but you've got to have a bucket list.
You got to have goals, for sure.
You've got to have goals.
Okay, well, if you ever need to borrow some tar or feathers, let me know.
I know the guy for that, yes.
Yeah.
Now.
Samuel Adams likely planned the 1773 Boston Tea Party, and in 1775, his attempted arrest helped spark the battles of Lexington and Concord, the first skirmish of the Revolutionary War. And lastly, Adams signed the Declaration of Independence and went on to serve as the governor of Massachusetts. Now, I have some other kind of trivia notes about Sam Adams, but first I want to get your take. What's his role in American history? Does he belong on this list?
I definitely think he belongs on this list, and especially one of the funny stories from presidential history is from John Adams going over to France to be a diplomat there in the negotiations to end the American Revolution. So he arrives in Paris, and they've heard of this guy, Adams. They've heard that there's this great leader from America named Adams.
Mm-hmm.
And then John Adams shows up and they're like, you're not le fameux Adams. You're not the famous Adams. You're the other Adams.
Yeah, because they're cousins, right?
Because they're cousins.
Yeah.
You can imagine, for anybody who knows John Adams and his self-professed vanity, how much it hurt him that he was referred to as the not famous Adams.
Yeah. And John Adams, is he the one that... I gotta look up his portrait real quick. Because it's either him or his son, John Quincy. It's Quincy Adams, his son, the 6th president of the United States, I want to say. John Quincy Adams is the grumpiest looking man I've ever seen. They probably got that from his father.
Yes, the Adams men were rather known for their grumpiness, but...
Yeah.
Yes. So Samuel Adams, he was from a different branch of the family. He was a cousin, and he was this firebrand. Like you said, he definitely got folks riled up. He got things going. And that was always the struggle with him. And especially as you get to the place of the early republic trying to organize things, he was a revolutionary, but he couldn't necessarily make that transition into the political schema of the Republic.
Yeah.
John Adams struggled with that on his own, but he was able to make more of the transition than Samuel Adams. But he was still this inspirational figure, and he was this key figure in the revolutionary period of American history.
And plus, he's got a great brand of beer, I think.
And there we go. We've got to do a toast to Samuel Adams.
And that's why I think I put him kind of high at number 4, because I think so many people have heard that name, even if they don't really know the history of him. But some other kind of interesting random facts about Sam Adams is, I have it here, second cousin of John Adams. And unlike many of the founders, Adams was staunchly anti-slavery. We're going to talk a lot about slavery today, Jerry, as we have to at this time period.
Yes.
Unfortunately. Adams was actively involved with colonial newspapers, publishing accounts of colonial sentiment over British colonial rule, which were fundamental in uniting the colonies. So again, he's kind of one of those early instigators that is getting people riled up. Adams suffered from what is now believed to have been an essential tumor, a movement disorder that rendered him unable to write in the final decade of his life. That's a long time to not write. And back then, this is the late 1700s, early 1800s. Your options for entertainment were reading the Bible or writing or working on your farm or something. So to take one of those away for a decade, I don't know. What are you doing with your free time,
Yeah.
But he was a controversial figure in American history. His contemporaries, both friends and foes, regarded him as one of the foremost leaders of the American Revolution. But in her 2022 biography of Adams, Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Stacy Schiff writes that Adams, quote, operated by stealth, melting into committees and crowd actions, pseudonyms, and smoky back rooms. So she kind of paints him as this kind of back of the room, how do you say it? He's not at the forefront necessarily, which kind of goes against what we said about the stuff he did to kind of rile people up in the first place,
Well,
what's your take on that?
One of the things that we have a trouble of understanding in the present day, because we think of the back room as being kind of hidden away from society, but the back rooms at that point were the movers and shakers. But that is where things happen, and that's where folks got riled up. At this time, like you said, Nick, this was before you could go on your phone and go to social media and see what the latest tweet is.
We'll need to double check the years on that. I'm not sure if social had been invented yet.
John Adams would have loved the internet. He would have been the biggest troll on the internet ever.
He reminds me kind of what Donald Trump was in his Twitter days. Just kind of like all caps, like frothing at the mouth.
But with words with a few more syllables, so...
Sure, well, that's not hard to do, but yes.
Yeah, so Samuel Adams, he was able to really organize folks behind the scenes, but also he was okay with being kind of on the stage. Sometimes these folks who operated behind the scenes were just as critical, if not more so, than the folks who everybody was looking at on the center stage.
Yeah. And it's interesting that these guys that are kind of operating in the background, so to speak, they are remembered hundreds of years later, despite not being at the forefront of things, which I think you had to be really influential in the background. He's still well known. He's still talked about, despite being, quote, a background player.
Yes.
And you bring up an interesting point that I think about sometimes, which is of all the stuff we know or think we know about history, think of all the stuff that has been lost to time. All the important people that have been lost to time, not just American history, but world history. It's really incredible. History is just such a fascinating thing. The things that survive through time, the things that don't. Should we talk about Sam's grouchy cousin, his vain cousin?
Let's talk about him because I'm sure that he is on this list too.
Yeah. So if you were ranking this list, Jerry, would you put John Adams above or below Sam Adams in terms of the average American being able to name him?
That is a good question.
I feel like you're too close to it, right?
I am too close to it because anybody who's involved with presidential history likely to be above, but the average folks, I'll go ahead and say below.
Yeah, that's what I did. I said John Adams is number 6. Sam Adams was 4. And you're right, John Adams has the presidency, which is huge, but unfortunate to say, but I just don't know if most people I walk up to on the street could tell me those early presidents outside of Washington and Lincoln. Maybe Thomas Jefferson. But John Adams had the presidency. Sam Adams has the beer brand, which honestly is a huge thing for his legacy. John Adams, we're going to talk about his ass. He is number 6. He's a distinguished Massachusetts lawyer. He became a relatively early proponent of the revolutionary cause. He defied anti-British sentiment and successfully defended British soldiers against murder charges arising from the Boston Massacre. Being a lawyer in 1700s America, it's got to be so weird. Adams served on the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. He journeyed overseas to secure French military aid and helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris. He chaired other key committees as well and even found time to draft the Massachusetts Constitution, which is still in use. And after about 10 years of diplomatic service abroad, he returned home in 1788 and subsequently became vice president under George Washington before eventually becoming president. I want to say the second president, right?
Yes.
1797 to 1801. Jerry, what's your just big picture, high-level take on John Adams' presidency? Was he an effective president?
So I will say for anybody who is more interested in John Adams' presidency,
please go listen to Jerry's podcast. He did like 100 episodes on it.
I really do hope that more folks do get interested in John Adams' presidency, because even though it was one term, 4 years, there was so much that happened in that time period. Unfortunately, Adams suffers from being sandwiched between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And because he lost re-election, he's not seen as being that important. He was. And that was one of his biggest legacies. We were at a point where the United States could have potentially ended up in a war with France. And John Adams defied his own party to pursue peace. And he got it. We got the Convention of Montfontaine, and we were able to avoid a war that he knew at the best it would be detrimental to the U.S. economy. We didn't have the Army and the Navy, the actual military force to be able to fight it. He knew that. And he said that was one of his great achievements as president, was to achieve peace. Unfortunately for him, it lost the support of his party, and the news of it came after he had already been defeated for re-election. But John Adams is one of those figures who is more deserving to be better known. He's also a very flawed man. And there's just something about him that it's just, you gotta love this old curmudgeon.
He lived to be 90, I read. He was born in 1735 and he died in 1826. So he was 90 years old in 1826.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Up until the 20th century, there was not a president who lived as long as John Adams. And that's one of the fascinating stories about American history and presidential history. Adams and Jefferson, this frenemy, they were friends, they became enemies, they ended up dying as friends. They started up this correspondence in their retirement that is just, again, if you want to dive into the history, look into the Adams-Jefferson letters. They're a fascinating correspondence where they just talk about so many subjects: philosophy, religion, history, current events at their time, their legacies. It's fascinating. But they ended up dying on the same day, which was also...
I have that here. Yeah.
Also...
50-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Is that what you're going to say? Yeah,
yes.
They died on the exact same day, 50 years to the day of the Declaration of Independence. I tell you, Jerry, I don't know. I don't believe in, higher powers and the universe making things happen, but that's a good one there to make me question that.
Although in the skeptical line of things, there were certain things that they could give folks to either keep them alive to a certain date or possibly have them die on a certain date.
Do you mean like as far as record keeping goes, or like physically their bodies dying?
Physically their bodies, medicines. Okay. They did have medicines that could potentially prolong, keep somebody alive. And James Madison, when he passed away, he actually died at the end of June. I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it's June 27th, but don't hold me to that. But his doctors did actually ask him, they were like, do you want us to try and keep you alive until July 4th? And he was like, no, I'm just done. I don't need that.
Do I want to sit here in misery for another week just so someone 200 years from now on a podcast could say, oh, and he died on the 4th of July. Isn't that neat?
Yeah.
No.
But there are theories that maybe there was something that kept them alive to the 4th, or we also know that there are medicines that...
For Adams and Jefferson.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the Jefferson-Adams letters, and they're really fascinating, but I'll tell you, I really didn't see that coming when they spent that weekend together in the Everglades, but only some published versions have that.
The magic happens in the Everglades.
Yeah, of course. And these men were lonely and old. And for one, John Adams, my next note, John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams, who was the 6th president, are the only presidents of the first 12 presidents who never owned slaves.
Yes.
John Adams was not a slave owner. I think he's the only one on this list. There might be one other one that never owned a slave. So that's something in his favor. So there were no slaves to keep him company in his dying days. So he had to turn to Jefferson in the Everglades. John Adams was also the first president to reside in the White House. And my last thing on Adams is that Ben Franklin, who might come up again later, he summed up what many thought of John Adams by saying, quote, he means well for his country. He's an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes and in some things absolutely out of his senses.
Yes.
And I think I read that in an Apple Podcast review about 10ish Podcast once as well. Sounded familiar, but I thought that was a good
Yes.
quote.
Adams and Franklin had their disagreements to the point that apparently they were staying in, at that point, it was not uncommon if you were staying in lodgings to be in the same bed with somebody. And
really?
So, yes. So you would...
Like a stranger, you mean? Same bed as a stranger?
Possibly a stranger, but in this case, traveling companions. So Adams and Franklin were traveling together. And so they were in the same bed, same room.
Oh my God.
And
that is like a sitcom idea, by the way, for any screenwriters listening.
And especially this night, because one of them, and I'm pretty sure that it was Franklin who said that we should leave the window open because, the fresh air will be invigorating. And the other one shut it. And they're like, well, it's cold outside and it's going to make us sick. And so, yes, it was very sitcom-esque of this going and opening the window, going and shutting the window. Yeah.
And I could just see them in like a nightie, like one of those old man, like long...
The long nightgowns, yes.
Yeah. Like Scrooge wears in the, what do you call it? What is that thing called? The
Christmas Carol?
Christmas Carol, yes, thank you. That's what they're wearing. Man, I got to dive more into that relationship, but let's talk about Ben Franklin, shall we?
Let's talk about him because I know he's on this list too.
Yeah, so if I had Sam Adams at 4 and John Adams at 6, where do you think I put Ben Franklin?
Ben Franklin has got to be closer to the top.
He's number 2. And there's only one person that is above him, obviously, clearly, because he's number 2.
Yeah.
But only one person that could be above him. I don't think anyone else can even come close as far as his notoriety. Ben Franklin, number 2, he is early America's foremost Renaissance man. He was a skilled author, printer, scientist, inventor, and diplomat, despite a formal education that ended at age 10, which I'd forgotten about that before this. Like, he stopped going to school at 10, and man, all the shit he did. When not designing bifocals, harnessing electricity, playing music, or publishing Poor Richard's Almanac, he worked constantly on civic projects to improve his adopted city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In fact, he was also the governor of Pennsylvania from 1785 to 1788. And Franklin is the only person to have signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Treaty of Alliance with France in 1778, the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and the U.S. Constitution in 1787. He is considered one of the leading founding fathers of the United States. His pervasive influence in the early history of the nation has led to his being called the only president of the United States who was never president of the United States. I think so many people like hear Ben Franklin and they just if they don't know their history or they haven't thought about history in a while, because not everyone is a nerd like you and I, Jerry. Not everyone thinks about this stuff. I think that average person's like, oh yeah, Ben Franklin, he was probably president, right? But he was not president.
And especially where he's on currency, folks are like, oh, well, everybody who's
That's
on
another thing.
currency was a president.
That's a good point. He's been on the $100 bill since 1914. So over 100 years now, he's been on that $100 bill. This is interesting. He's the oldest of the founding fathers. He was born in 1706, and he was the first to die among the founding fathers in 1790.
Yeah.
I think he's the only one on here that didn't make it to the 1800s. No, there's one more.
It's so fascinating because that was at the point. So the government under the Constitution was just starting. And here you have this monumental figure. And I was actually talking with somebody a few weeks back, and they were just so surprised at how pervasive this Franklin mania was. It kept on for decades. He was still viewed as this pivotal figure. You know, it didn't just stop when he passed away. It isn't a recent thing. He's been this monumental figure in American history
during his lifetime too.
During his lifetime and after he was, and I'm pretty sure I know who number one on this list is, and is even more so, but he was a superstar. And at a time where you didn't have hundreds and thousands of people for competing for that attention, he was just known not only in the nation, but across the globe. He went to France and he was the celebrity. Everybody wanted to be around Benjamin Franklin, and he played into that. He knew how to work the media. He would put on his fur cap and play this frontiersman, but then he could speak to the French philosophers. He could speak to political theory and philosophy and science and technology. And part of the reason why he is such a key figure to the revolution is that he was able to convince the French government to support this upstart nation. That was key. We needed the French. We needed them to bankroll the revolution and to provide some military support. And that turned the tide. As soon as we were able to secure French support, we were able to achieve independence. And Franklin played such a large role in that.
And he had a hell of an ass, too.
He had a hell of an ass.
A big ass.
As many French women would agree.
Yes. All right. Let's get into it then, Jerry. I'm ready because I have some notes here about his lifestyle. In 1730, 24-year-old Franklin publicly acknowledged his, quote, illegitimate son, William Franklin, and raised him in his household. William's mother was unknown. Now, William Franklin, his son, was a loyalist to the king. So his relationship with his father broke down over their differences about the American Revolutionary War, and Benjamin Franklin could never accept William's position. I thought that was interesting that he had this, quote, illegitimate son that he disagreed with. And that brings me to my next question. Jerry, is it true that Ben Franklin was a bit of a horn dog? He loved his French women, huh?
There are certainly enough stories. He was at the very least flirtatious, but it was also a time where this was seen as acceptable, and especially in certain circles. So we see some other folks who aren't as well known for being in this flirtatious and possibly sexual liberated ideal that was going on at the time. They're not as well known, but because Franklin has become something that's become some of his mythos, he gets more of that reputation. But it was, I think, more common than we generally think of.
I see. So it kind of gets attached to his legend at some point along the way, and it becomes a focal point over time, more so than it should be.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I'm going to stick with it that he was a horn dog, though, just so you know. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Some other random facts about Franklin is he was a vegetarian. Did you know that? You knew that? You're nodding?
Yes.
That's just, you look at pictures of Ben Franklin, and I wouldn't have thought that man's a vegetarian, but here we are. He was also an avid chess player. He was playing chess around 1733, making him the first chess player known by name in the American colonies. And in fact, he was inducted into the U.S. Chess Hall of Fame in 1999. This is insane. You think they dug him up to accept the Hall of Fame induction, or probably
just propped him up against something,
Yeah.
He had a good time.
Prop him up against a couple of French women on their hands and knees.
Exactly.
Like, stacked up like a pyramid, and then he leans against them.
They got a random pinch here and there. It's okay.
Random pinch. Listen to you. All right, so let's talk about slavery.
Yes.
Franklin initially owned and dealt in slaves, but by the late 1750s, he began arguing against slavery. He became an abolitionist and promoted education and the integration of African Americans into U.S. society. So he started bad, turned out good as far as slavery goes. So he did suffer from obesity throughout his middle age and elder years, which resulted in multiple health problems, particularly gout, which worsened as he aged. In poor health during the signing of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, he was rarely seen from that point forward in public until his death. He did die in his home in Philadelphia in 1790. He was aged 84. His last words were reportedly, quote, "A dying man could do nothing easy," to his daughter after she suggested that he change position in bed and lie on his side so he can breathe more easily. And if I'm his daughter, I'm thinking, all right, asshole, just turn over already. So, you don't have to give me some, profound quote. Just turn over. Just trying to get out of here. This room smells.
Please, for the love of heaven, just turn over.
Just turn over. I get it, Dad. Yes, a man can't do nothing easy. That's great. Turn over.
Putting some more of those blade things around, trying to...
those plug-in things, yeah.
You like the window open, right? It's okay. Clear this out.
Who was it? John Adams? Did you say John Adams told me you like the window open? He said you made a big fuss about it at your hotel one night.
Big fuss about it. Here we go.
Okay, foundational in defining American ethos, Franklin has been called the most accomplished American of his age and the most influential in inventing the type of society America would become. There's no arguing that, no matter what you can say about the man. That's Ben Franklin. So, who else you got?
Let's go with somebody who I think is going to be a little lower down on the list. Patrick Henry.
Patrick Henry is in my honorable mentions.
Nice.
I didn't make the list. I ranked the list, but I didn't pick the 8. So if you disagree with that, take it up with whoever I said earlier.
Whoever.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm going to go with a wild card here. Robert Morris.
Another honorable mention. 3 total presidents are left on this list.
So let's go ahead and go with James Madison.
James Madison, who you're currently knee-deep in James Madison land over on your show. He is, well, I'll ask you, where does he rank? Where is he on this list in the top 8?
He's going to be in the lower end of the list.
Yeah. So John Adams was 6. James Madison is 7.
Yep.
Okay, so he was a state legislature, and at the 1787 Constitutional Convention, he proved to be perhaps the most influential delegate, developing a plan to divide the federal government into 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, each with checks and balances on its power. We still use those today. This plan, which was largely adopted, earned him the moniker Father of the Constitution. Madison next co-authored the Federalist Papers and, as a U.S. congressman, became the driving force behind the Bill of Rights. He was elected president after serving as Jefferson's Secretary of State. So that's a lot of shit I just read. I mean, the father of the Constitution, he came up with the 3 branches, he co-authored the Federalist Papers, driving force behind the Bill of Rights. He was president. Why does no one talk about James Madison, Jerry?
Because...
Besides you.
Besides me, yes.
Yeah.
Because James Madison was somebody who really, and we talked about this earlier with Sam Adams, he operated kind of behind the scenes.
Okay.
He was the fixer. It wasn't this grandiose riding out on a white horse kind of thing that some of the other figures did, but he knew how to get things done. He was in some ways more accomplished than one of the other better known presidents who is on this list. But because he was always operating behind the scenes, he doesn't get as much attention. And ultimately, when he became president and was supposed to be that center stage person, it worked against him. It took him a while to get out from his predecessor's shadow to really define his own take to the presidency.
Because he came immediately after Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
Big shoes to fill.
Big shoes to fill, and he inherited many issues that were still lingering from the Jefferson presidency.
He was also kind of an asshole because we talked about Ben Franklin and John Adams as being anti-slavery, or at the very least not owning their own slaves. That was not the case for Madison. He was a slave owner, and in 1783, to prevent a slave rebellion at his plantation, Montpelier, Madison freed one of his slaves, but he did not free any slaves in his will. That works against him. Something else that works against him is either by treaty or through war, Native American tribes had to cede 26 million acres of land to the United States under his presidency. So that's another mark against him. Leading historians have generally ranked him, though, as an above-average president, although they are critical of his endorsement of slavery and his leadership during the War of 1812. I have a quote here from historian J.C.A. Stagg, who writes that in some ways, because he was on the winning side of every important issue facing the young nation from 1776 to 1816, Madison was the most successful and possibly the most influential of all the founding fathers.
Yeah.
Which is saying a lot, considering some of the people we've already covered.
I would agree with that. I think that he was so much more influential than he necessarily gets credit for. But to your point, Nick, and especially in his personal dealings.
In other news, Madison Square Garden is named after James Madison. So there's that.
There is that.
It is fascinating. And, I'll direct listeners to Presidencies of the United States, the podcast, because you will learn all the ins and outs of the James Madison presidency and administration and his life and times. So definitely check that out. Ads suck, right? Ads are the worst. And I feel bad for you that you're hearing my shitty ad right now, because your fellow listeners are skipping this very ad even as we speak. 10-Inch Pod Plus members never hear an ad on 10-Inch Podcast ever. They don't even know this ad exists. You could stop fucking around and join them on the new and improved 10-Inch Pod Plus. It's now easier than ever to sign up. It takes literally about 10 seconds. Better yet, after sign up, you can add the 10-Inch Pod Plus feed into your favorite podcast app in just one tap, including Spotify. That's right, no extra apps or know-how needed to enjoy 10-Inch Podcast episodes early and ad-free in the podcast app you're already using. Plus, get exclusive members-only bonus episodes you can't hear anywhere else. We have over 60 bonus episodes available right now, with more added every month. You can also upgrade to the new Peanut Butter Fiend plan to get all of these benefits, plus a free shirt, mug, or hat after sign-up. You'll also get to choose the top 10 list for an upcoming episode, and you'll gain exclusive access to our new blooper reel every month. Peanut Butter Fiends can also watch a full video format of every week's episode, unedited and uncut. To get started, just go to 10inchpod.com/plus. Pick the plan that's right for you, starting at just $2.99 per month. And all plans come with a free 7-day trial. Try it out and cancel anytime, no commitment. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, you can also sign up from right within the Apple Podcast app. Just go to our Apple page and tap the Try Free button at the top of the page. With just one tap, your 10-Inch Podcast feed will instantly refresh with all of our ad-free and bonus content unlocked. It's that simple. Go to 10inchpod.com/plus to join now for your free 7-day trial. After that, you'll never hear an ad like this one again. Who do you have next on this list? There's 2 presidents and 2 non-presidents.
I'm going to go with another wild card, Gouverneur Morris.
No.
I highly recommend folks looking up Gouverneur Morris because he is a fascinating character. He had a very notorious end to his life.
Oh, really? Someone else that has had a very dramatic ending to their life on this list.
Somebody who has had a musical. Alexander Hamilton.
You are a smart guy. This one was hard to rank because on one hand, I don't think most people could tell you about his historical past.
No.
On the other hand, so many people have seen or heard of the musical. Kind of like the Samuel Adams thing with the beer and his story. I ended up putting Hamilton at number 5, right below Sam Adams. He was a poor orphan born out of wedlock. He immigrated as a teenager from the British West Indies to New York. He rose to prominence as an aide-de-camp to George Washington during the Revolutionary War and became an impassioned supporter of a strong central government. After attending the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he wrote the majority of the highly persuasive Federalist Papers, which argued for the Constitution's ratification. Washington then tapped him to serve as the first U.S. Treasury Secretary, a position he used to push for the creation of a national bank, and Hamilton was later immortalized on the $10 bill. Scholars generally regard Hamilton as an astute and intellectually brilliant administrator, politician, and financier who was sometimes impetuous. His ideas are credited with laying the foundation for American government and finance. I have more, but what are your big picture thoughts on Hamilton?
We are living in Hamilton's world. And that's one of the things that, for better or worse, Hamilton did have a pronounced influence on the course of American history.
Is that because of the money element?
The money element and the War of 1812. So the shift that happened in the Madison administration, when you're trying to fund a war and you don't have a national bank, you have very limited ways of getting funds to prosecute this war. You start to see, well, maybe Hamilton was right. Maybe this is the way that we need to go. And so you have Madison, you have Monroe, you have John Quincy Adams starting to turn to more of the Hamiltonian view of things. And this is after he had actually been assassinated, the duel, all that had happened.
Spoiler, goddammit, Jerry. I'm going to get
there. To that. Yes. We'll get to that. He was long gone by this point. But Hamilton had such an influence. But Hamilton also, whenever you start to look into his life and his career, Hamilton really stumbled over himself. The biggest enemy to Alexander Hamilton was Alexander Hamilton. Mm-hmm. Case in point, he had an affair and it was found out by political enemies. They agreed to keep it hush-hush because he wasn't doing anything untoward in terms of his actual office. But when it came revealed and it started to come out that he had this affair, we think of nowadays political scandals and you deny. No, Hamilton went ahead and wrote this 90-something page treatise about his affair and had all the details. He thought it was a good idea because it ended up with this, well, I didn't do anything wrong as Secretary of the Treasury. It was like, you missed the point. You really didn't understand. You made this a bigger scandal than it had to be.
And let's call a spade a spade. If there were any one of these men on this list that did not have an affair, I'd be surprised, honestly.
Yes.
But hey, it's funny that even in these early days of American government, we're still having like backhanded deals and blackmail and scandals and media hush hush and like all the shit you still see today, just differently. It's always there. It's always been around.
Oh, yes.
As far as the scandal goes with the affair and it did or didn't affect his job as Secretary of the Treasury, what about his emails? Somebody get in his emails and see what he did. And I want to see his laptop too. That's where we find the real...
the scandal is Benghazi. It's always Benghazi.
I want to know where Hillary Clinton was at the time that Hamilton was having his affair.
Yes.
Well, on the plus side for Hamilton, he was a leader in the abolition of the international slave trade. That's good. But here's the juicy shit with Hamilton. In 1804, by the way, side note, have you seen the musical Hamilton?
I have.
Okay, I haven't, actually. Do they cover his ending in that musical?
I mean, they briefly mention it.
Okay. I just didn't know if like this is common knowledge because everyone's seen this musical or not, because I haven't seen it, so I don't know. Anyway, In 1804, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, they tied for the presidency in the Electoral College, and despite philosophical differences, Hamilton endorsed Jefferson over Burr, whom he found unprincipled, which is kind of rich coming from Hamilton, sounds like. But when Burr ran for governor of New York in 1804, Hamilton again campaigned against him, arguing that he was untrustworthy. Taking offense, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. It's like, okay, we'll get back to, it's wild. In the July 11th, 1804 duel in Weehawken, New Jersey, Burr shot Hamilton in the stomach. Hamilton was immediately transported to the home of William Bayard Jr. in Greenwich Village for medical attention, but succumbed to his wounds the following day. Jerry, in the early 1800s, in America, we're still dueling. And Aaron Burr, correct me if I'm wrong, but he didn't get in trouble for killing Hamilton because it was like a gentlemanly duel, right?
It's complicated.
Okay.
Yes, duels were still a thing, and they actually continued to be a thing for a couple more decades after
Through the
this.
American West, for sure, like cowboy times. Yeah.
At this time, that idea of prestige, that idea of honor was so important to people in the elites, the upper echelons of society.
Yeah.
That here's where you've dishonored me. Are you willing to admit publicly you were wrong? If you're not, then let's go ahead and take things further along.
Take things outside.
Yeah. Take things outside and you take it to the dueling ground.
Catch me outside.
And Hamilton, his son, a couple of years prior to this duel, had actually died in a duel. And so Hamilton had actually argued against dueling, but for some reason with this, he just did not back down. He was not willing to admit, I was wrong. Burr, there were attempts to prosecute him. So in the state of New York, dueling was illegal, which is why they went to New Jersey. New Jersey, dueling wasn't illegal, but murder was. And so they did try to attempt to prosecute him for murder there. They tried to prosecute him for dueling in New York, even though it didn't happen in New York. Both of those ended up, the cases were thrown out. Nothing came of them. But there was a time that Burr, who at this point, we need to say, was the vice president of the United States.
That's the wild thing about it. Like, yes, I can picture two cowboys dueling, but like these are two highly ranked government officials. It's just so weird. The vice president. Imagine Kamala Harris in a duel today. It's just weird. But hey.
Yes. And
I'd pay to see it though.
That would be interesting. And especially whoever was her dueling partner, can we take a
Marjorie
poll
Taylor Greene.
There we go.
That would sell out Madison Square Garden, speaking of James Madison.
But that was a fascinating thing. Like, Burr ended up presiding over the Senate with this black cloud over him, and knowing that he was at that point being indicted in 2 states over this matter, but he was still presiding over the U.S. Senate.
Although today they have rapists and pedophiles on the in Congress, so like Matt Gaetz and all that. So
yeah,
not the worst thing for a sitting government official, but I get your point.
Again, we've been there before.
Yeah. What's interesting is that there was a plan at one point to replace Hamilton on the $10 bill.
Yes.
That was actually shelved during the Obama presidency because of the popularity that Hamilton kind of rediscovered through the musical Hamilton.
Yes.
So the musical saved the $10 bill.
I actually participated in a focus group with the then Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew.
Really?
The main person that folks were advocating for replacing him was Harriet Tubman.
That's right.
And there are so many folks who didn't necessarily want Hamilton to be replaced. We would have rathered Andrew Jackson on...
Yeah, no shit.
Yeah.
Andrew Jackson on the 20, right?
Yeah.
Replace his ass.
And Secretary Lew explained the cycle of it and how long it would take for that to happen. Funny enough, it seems like that's how things are moving, that will be the person who's replaced. It's taken longer than we would have wanted, but it was interesting participating in that conversation. And that was where the group arrived that if we have to replace Hamilton, we will, but really we want to replace Jackson.
And that seems like a matter of time.
Yeah.
And then someone else on the this $2 bill.
Let's go ahead and talk about Thomas Jefferson.
Your boy, Thomas Jefferson. I have him at number 3.
Yes.
To recap quickly, you're missing 8. 7 was James Madison. 6 is John Adams. 5 is Alexander Hamilton. 4 is Samuel Adams. 3 is Thomas Jefferson. 2 is Benjamin Franklin. You're missing 1. But we all know who it is. So, Thomas Jefferson, he was well-educated and prosperous. He was a Virginia lawyer and politician who came to believe the British Parliament held no authority over the 13 colonies. In 1776, he was given the immense task of writing the Declaration of Independence, in which he famously declared that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Although, as a lifelong owner of enslaved people, he did not extend these concepts to Black Americans, but we will revisit that shortly. But he later served as vice president to John Adams prior to himself becoming president in 1801, and he served 2 terms. Is that right?
He did.
So he was a slave owner, but did condemn the slave trade in his draft of the Declaration of Independence and signed the act prohibiting importation of slaves in 1807. So kind of a mixed bag. I feel we talked about this last time you were here on the Scandals episode, that Jefferson was rumored to have had children by the enslaved Sally Hemings. According to scholarly consensus, Jefferson probably fathered at least 6 children with Hemings, including 4 that survived to adulthood.
One of the things that complicates that even more is that Sally Hemings was the half-sister of his wife, Martha Washington.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Yeah.
So, okay, but they're not related, so that's okay. So
yeah. They're not related.
Jefferson and her are not related, yes, but she was related to his wife. Okay.
There were accounts of Sally Hemings that she did bear a resemblance to his wife, who passed away, and the family lore is that she made him promise not to remarry. Then he started up the relationship with Sally Hemings after that.
His wife was already gone.
Yeah.
So essentially it was just looked down upon at the time for like.
And again, it's one of those things that it's complicated. And Jefferson's approach was generally don't address it, just let it ride out. And it wasn't so much because she was enslaved, it was because she was Black. And miscegenation.
Of course, yeah, I see.
And that was the problem. You mentioned that she had 4 children who lived to adulthood. So 2 we know their lineage. 2 were given their time, as it was called in those days. Jefferson made arrangements. He went ahead and gave them money. They went to the North because they were able to pass as white. And so they fade into history. We don't know what happened to them because they're passing as white people. And so we don't know what happened to those children. They disappeared and faded into white culture.
Yeah, they're kind of intentionally so. Yeah, but it's complicated, like you said. Jefferson, kind of a controversial figure because of this and his slavery relationship in general. But despite that, he is consistently ranked among the top 10 presidents in American history. And I'm going to shift gears here. This was interesting. I pulled this. I often hear from people that, this was a nation founded under God, or it was a religious nation, but it's not. Like other founding fathers, Jefferson was considered a deist, subscribing to the liberal religious strand in deism that values reason over revelation and rejects traditional Christian doctrines, including the virgin birth, original sin, and the resurrection of Jesus. Things like one nation under God wasn't added to the Pledge of Allegiance till the 1900s, stuff like that. So I just think that's good to remind people every once in a while.
Absolutely.
I'm going to do a quick sidestep here randomly, but I just came across it in my notes and remembered. I want to tell my listeners to follow me on TikTok. This is a reminder. Pull up your phone right now. Go to TikTok. Open the app up in your phone. I know you have it. Search for 10ish Pod. You can follow us there. We have video snippets of every week's episode. You'll see me and Jerry on camera talking in a video this week. We have list countdowns that I do, kitty videos, and more. 10ish Pod on TikTok. Please follow us. Jerry, thank you for indulging me for that brief intermission. Now, please give me another guess. You just need number 8 and number 1.
Oh, gosh. So I know number 1.
This guy was the second governor of New York.
John Jay.
John Jay. No argument, right? John Jay being number 8 out of 8 on this
absolutely.
list. Okay. He is interesting, though, his story. So he was a lawyer. He originally preferred reconciling with Britain rather than fighting for independence, but once the war broke out, he wholeheartedly joined the side of the colonists, serving among other roles as a diplomat to Spain and helped to negotiate the Treaty of Paris. Upon returning to the States, Jay served as a Secretary of Foreign Affairs under the Articles of Confederation and authored a few of the Federalist Papers. And finally, in 1789, he became the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and 6 years later was elected the second governor of New York. I want to talk about his time as justice, because that's fascinating. The Jay Court, as it was called, experienced a light workload, deciding just 4 cases over 6 years. Are you hearing me? Is everyone out? 4 cases, Supreme Court cases in a 6-year period. What's the deal, Jerry? Why?
It took a while for the federal judiciary to really kick up. More of the work at that time was done at kind of the district court level. And at that time, they had what they called riding circuit. So each justice had their designated circuit. They had to ride around to various states and sit on district courts in that area. That was really more of the work. It wasn't when the Supreme Court came together to hear cases. It was hearing these at the district court level. It was difficult at that time. You know, transportation was very primitive.
Yeah.
Roads, if they existed, were really ramshackle. It wasn't a great condition. And especially for folks who rode the Southern Circuit, you were in a lot of wilderness. It was not good conditions. If you had an inn that you could sleep in, it wasn't a good one. This was bed bug central. It was awful.
And in the room next to you, you got Ben Franklin and John Adams arguing about a window.
Exactly.
Can't get any sleep because they're yelling about this damn window.
You weren't getting much sleep in these inns, if you could even get to the inn.
Yeah.
It wasn't what we think of the court nowadays. It was not an envious position. And so with John Jay as Chief Justice, George Washington realized that we were having difficult relations with Great Britain at the time. He wanted somebody to go and negotiate with them. And he was like, John Jay, well, you really don't have that much to do. I mean, you know, you've got your 4 cases over the last few years.
4 cases over 6 years.
Yeah. So why don't you go to London and talk with the British? You know, you've been involved with foreign affairs. You've negotiated with the British before. You would be a great guy for this. And it'll give you something to actually do. And so you have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court traveling across the Atlantic at a time that it would take months to get there, take months to get communication back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
The Chief Justice is out of the country for the better part of a year negotiating a treaty. It's just something that we cannot imagine nowadays.
No. I always think about just the transportation of people, things, and news back in like any time before, I don't know, the 20th century is wild.
Yeah.
And this is the 18th century.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense when you say it like that. But even still, 4 cases over 6 years? Come on. Good scene. Done a little more. So let's talk about his slave record. Jay is recorded as owning 5 slaves in the 1790 and 1800 U.S. Census, but he freed all but one by the 1810 Census. And in 1819, he wrote a letter condemning Missouri's bid for admission to the Union as a slave state, saying that slavery, quote, ought not to be introduced nor permitted in any of the new states.
Yeah.
kind of an interesting take, right? Like, I had slaves. I still have one. It's my favorite slave, I guess. And any state that is already in existence, let's leave that alone. But any new states, it's kind of like he wanted it both ways a little bit.
Yeah. And he wasn't alone in that. There are so many folks who were anti-slavery but weren't necessarily for civil rights.
I think Lincoln might have been like that, right?
Exactly. Towards the beginning, Lincoln was in that vein. He has this famous quote of, if he could preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, he would. If he could preserve the Union by freeing no slaves, he would. He was really of this position of ending the spread of slavery, but not necessarily against slavery and not necessarily for civil rights. And you see an evolution in his thinking as president. But yeah, this was not uncommon.
Let's talk about someone who loved slaves maybe more than anyone else on the list.
Yes.
That's number one. Who is it, Jerry?
It is His Excellency, Mr. President, George Washington.
Mr. America, George Washington, is number one. He is the most famous among these, I think, easily. Although I think Ben Franklin could maybe, he might give him a run for his money, but outside of those two, those are a clear top two. Yeah. Anyway, Washington, before he fought against the British, he fought for the British, serving as a commander in the French and Indian War. As a prosperous Virginia farmer, he came to resent the various taxes and restrictions being imposed on the colonies by the British Crown. Am I interpreting this kind of the same as, like, in modern day, a billionaire not wanting to pay their fair share of taxes? I mean, not that Washington was a billionaire, but, the same kind of thing, like...
The equivalent of the time, yes.
Yeah, okay. Once the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, he was placed in charge of the Continental Army, and with the help of his French allies, they were able to expel the British by 1783. In 1789, he was overwhelmingly elected the first president of the United States, and he is aptly known as the father of his country. So now I just have a collection of fun facts here. The first use of George Washington's portrait on the $1 bill was in 1869. Washington, he's known for his famous wooden dentures, right? He frequently suffered from severe tooth decay and ultimately lost all of his teeth but one. He had several sets of false teeth during his presidency. Contrary to common lore, these were not made of wood but of metal, ivory, bone, animal teeth, and human teeth possibly obtained from slaves.
Yes.
Okay, so you knew that already?
Yes. Supposedly, and granted, it's like, first of all, just cannot imagine, hey, give me your teeth.
Hopefully they were already dead, I would hope. And that
no.
You're saying no. Okay.
Because he would pay them for their teeth.
Oh wow.
But no, they were still living, and he would take the teeth of enslaved individuals.
Wow. Himself? Did he personally do it with like pliers or something?
No, that was one thing that George Washington did delegate to other people.
Okay. I mean, that's horrible.
Yeah.
I guess it's better that he paid them than just taking it, but I'm sure he paid them pennies on the dollar because he knew he could get it for cheap.
Yeah.
Wow. And it says here that he had lost all but one of his teeth.
He had one tooth. He was suffering from severe oral health issues, and so he wasn't.
Did he
really
have dental disease, or was it just poor dental hygiene for his whole life, or do you know?
At that point, there wasn't as much known about dental hygiene, and it just...
Oh, you don't fucking say. They weren't the top of the class for dental hygiene in the 1700s?
I mean, you just put leeches on it. It's fine. It's okay. Everything's fine. Yeah, he did suffer from poor dental health. I wouldn't be grinning either.
Yeah. Think about it, his poor wife had to kiss that mouth.
Yeah.
With the animal teeth and everything else that those dentures were made of.
Yeah. Whose teeth are in your mouth?
Ugh. Blech. I don't like teeth.
Jerry. No.
On the plus side, so he had bad teeth, but he was an excellent dancer, Jerry, and he frequently attended the theater. He even drank alcohol in moderation, but was morally opposed to excessive drinking, smoking, tobacco, gambling, and profanity. Sounds like a great hang. Okay, on December 13, 1799, he had a sore throat, but was well enough to mark trees for cutting. That evening, Washington complained of chest congestion. The next morning, however, he awoke to an inflamed throat and difficulty breathing. He ordered a state overseer, George Rawlins, to remove nearly a pint of his blood. You mentioned the leeches. Bloodletting was a common practice of the time, which in hindsight is so fucking stupid. They continued the process of bloodletting to approximately 5 pints, which I think you have 10 pints in you.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so half of his body's blood was drained. Big surprise, his condition continued to deteriorate. Finally, he told the doctors to get out of here, and he said, quote, "Doctor, I die hard, but I'm not afraid to go." And to that I say, motherfucker, of course you're dying hard. We just drained half your body of blood. But all right.
And you're somehow still living.
And you're somehow still giving us quotable quotes to print on a t-shirt or get as a tattoo. I die hard, but I'm not afraid to go. Maybe that's where Bruce Willis got the idea. On his deathbed, out of fear for being entombed alive, which I think was kind of common at the time, he instructed his private secretary, Tobias Lear, to wait 3 days before his burial. According to Lear, Washington died between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. on December 14, 1799, with Martha seated, his wife Martha seated at the foot of his bed. His last words were, "'Tis well," from his conversation with Lear about his burial. He was 67 years old, and I want to say, besides maybe Alexander Hamilton, he was actually the youngest death on this list.
Yeah.
Which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
67, not too bad for the time period.
It's amazing. So many of the early presidents, and really even into the 20th century, there are so many presidents who died basically sped along by the treatment that they received. And Washington,
right, like bloodletting.
Yeah, Washington was the first example of this. If not for his doctors, he may have survived.
Right. After his death, he became an international symbol for liberation and nationalism as the leader of the first successful revolution against a colonial empire. However, in the 21st century, his reputation has been critically scrutinized. Along with other founding fathers that we've talked about today, he has been condemned for holding enslaved people. During his lifetime, over 577 enslaved people lived and worked at Mount Vernon. That's a lot. And they're all walking around with like barely any teeth left, apparently. Though he expressed the desire to see the abolition of slavery come through legislation, he did not initiate or support any initiatives for bringing about its end. This has led to calls from some activists to remove his name from public buildings and his statues from public spaces. Nonetheless, Washington maintains his place among the highest-ranked U.S. presidents. Jerry, where do you stand on that? And I know it's kind of a slippery slope, but someone as important, no matter what you can say about him, he's one of the most important Americans to ever live. So do we remove his name from public buildings and things like that because of his stance on slavery? I don't know. It's tricky.
It becomes a conversation. One thing that I do agree with Jefferson on, Jefferson very much felt that the world is for the living and that we shouldn't necessarily be beholden to tradition or to what was decisions that were made by previous generations in what we do. And likewise with this issue, I think that we do need to consider and reflect what is the purpose of having this, whether it's a statue to Washington or something named after Washington or whatever.
Monument.
Washington Monument. Does it still serve a purpose to this day? And what is that purpose? And to that respect, I don't think that we can completely, obviously, with the podcast that I'm doing, I don't think that we should forget our history. However,
no, we
should also figure out how that history fits into the present day and what lessons we take from it. And so I think that it's good to have these discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And whether the decision is made to remove a name or a statue or whatever or not, as long as we're intentional in that decision and as long as it's being made by the present community and by all members of the community, it can't just be one segment, because that's part of the problem of American history. a small segment of the population has made decisions for all, we all need to be at the table now and make decisions for where we're at and where we're going.
Well said. I mean, it's tricky with Washington because you can't talk about him without talking about his importance, his influence, all that, but you can't not mention 577 enslaved people living on his estate and his lack of action for the end of slavery compared to some of his contemporaries. All that said, he is well regarded as far as his presidency, and he is one of the founding fathers of America, and I put him as the number one most well-known founding father. I'm going to go back through the top 8. When I'm done, I want to know from you, Jerry, if there's any moving you do as far as their ranking. So I have number 8 as John Jay, number 7, James Madison, the 4th president of the United States. John Adams at number 6, the 2nd president of the United States. Alexander Hamilton at number 5, who died in an 1804 duel with Aaron Burr. We have 4, Samuel Adams. 3, Thomas Jefferson, who's also the 3rd president of the United States. 2, Benjamin Franklin, Horn Dog. And number 1, the 1st president of the United States, George Washington. What do you think? Do I have that ranking about right?
Nick, I think you hit this one out of the park.
Really?
Of course, any person who listens to presidencies will know that I will talk about the lesser known figures much more than maybe anybody in 200 years' time has talked about them. But these are the folks that are really well known. You've got your Washington, you've got Franklin, you've got Jefferson. They have made such a mark in history and such a mark in culture that you go up to folks, they're at least going to know the name, even if they don't know the specifics. Yeah. You ask somebody about John Jay,
most people, the average person probably wouldn't recognize the name. Yeah. It's a cool name, though. It sounds like a Hollywood actor name or something.
And that's probably what they would ask. Okay, well, what's he in?
Well, what's he been in?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You said it perfectly. Like, you ask someone about George Washington, every single person in America and most of the world has heard that name.
Yeah.
John Jay, not so much. So, yeah, these are the founding fathers of America, according to historians. And Jerry is the founding father of the podcast Presidencies of the United States. We've talked about it a lot on this episode. I want people to know that if you want to listen to it, there's a link in the show notes to go find it. But Jerry, is there anything else you want to share about the podcast or how people can find it?
Presidencies is available pretty much anywhere fine podcasts can be found. You can look up the website at presidenciespodcast.com. If you're interested in learning about the people behind just the names and dates and lists out there, please come to Presidencies. We have so many stories to tell about individuals that make up our very complicated historical legacy. And I look forward to anybody who joins us to sharing those with you. And Nick, I cannot thank you enough for the opportunity to come on the Tennis Podcast again. As always, it is so much fun, and I always enjoy the opportunity to talk with you and to be able to geek out on history for a bit.
Yes, and Jerry, that's why I have you here, because I like to geek out on history. And to Jerry's point, like if you enjoyed today's topic, you need to go listen to Presidencies, because we are just barely scratching the surface here. Jerry's been doing this for, I want to say 5+ years, right?
Yes.
And I mean, he's just now, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but he's just now going through the 4th presidency of the United States, because he's covering so many different people throughout the story of each presidency. So, and I've been on the show talking about, who was it? It was for a seat at the table for Jefferson's presidency.
Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember who you...
Oh,
yes, John Breckinridge.
That's right. So you can find me on that show too. But yes, thank you, Jerry, so much for being here. And thank you to the listeners for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would encourage you, I would beg you on my hands and knees to rate us 5 stars and leave a quick review on your podcast app of choice, especially Apple and Spotify. It takes a few seconds. It really helps us out. Thank you for that. Thanks for listening. Bye.